Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are analyzing a really high stakes confrontation.
It really is.
It basically pits the new digital architecture of finance against the old, the established powers of Wall Street.
And this isn't just some squabble over currency. It's a much deeper argument.
Right. It's about who gets to define what financial stability and risk even mean.
The players in this arena are, well, they're massive. On one side, we have Paolo Ardoino. He's the CEO of Tether, which manages the world's biggest stablecoin. And on the other side, the institutional gatekeeper itself, S&P Global. The credit ratings agency, their word can move markets.
So our mission for this deep dive is, I think, really crucial. We're going to extract the technical and the practical lessons from this huge dispute.
So that you, the learner, can learn to assess risk and safety based on things you can actually verify.
Exactly, based on assets, not just prestigious labels.
Before we get into the conflict itself, maybe we should quickly define the stablecoin at the center of all this.
Good idea. We're talking about Tether, or USDT.
Right. In the crypto world, you have these huge price swings with Bitcoin, Ethereum. It's incredibly volatile.
Tether is designed to be the anchor in that storm. It's supposed to hold a strict one-to-one peg with the US dollar.
It's a safe harbor.
That's the perfect way to put it. When markets get chaotic, investors rush out of those volatile assets and into Tether.
And that whole ecosystem is built on one simple but absolute promise.
That for every single Tether token out
There has to be an equivalent amount of real-world assets backing it up. The market has to trust that promise.
And that promise is exactly where S&P Global decided to strike.
They published an assessment on stablecoin stability, and, well, they rated Tether's ability to maintain its dollar peg is very low.
Very low is. It's almost an understatement. S&P rated Tether at a level 4 on a 5-point scale.
And level 5 is the weakest possible score.
So S&P was effectively broadcasting a major concern. They were saying Tether might not be able to honor that one-to-one commitment if there's a major market shock.
And the immediate consequence of a rating like that is just a huge wave of FUD.
Fear, uncertainty, and doubt.
Exactly. Because S&P is such a recognized name, that headline alone, major ratings agency doubts Tether, that can trigger panic.
It's the institutional version of someone yelling fire in a crowded theater. Or maybe your bank is about to collapse.
Right. But Paolo Ardoino's response was not what you'd expect. He didn't just issue some carefully worded corporate statement.
No, he launched an aggressive counterattack. He called S&P's methods flawed, outdated, and most importantly, hypocritical.
And that hypocrisy charge is really the core of his whole defense. He points directly back to early 2023.
The bank collapses. The bank collapses, specifically Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank. Now, here's the critical part. S&P Global had given those banks high, safe ratings just days before they suffered catastrophic bank runs and were shut down.
So Ardoino's question is pretty devastating.
How can an agency that got it so wrong with traditional banks rating them as safe right up until they failed, now claim that Tether, which holds arguably safer assets, is the risky one?
To get that, we really need to unpack the difference between how those banks operated and how Tether operates.
Let's start with traditional banking. It's based on something called fractional reserve banking.
Right. So if you deposit, say, $100 into your bank account, the bank is only required to keep a tiny fraction of that on hand.
Sometimes as little as $10, or even less.
And the rest, the other $90, is immediately lent out. Mortgages, business loans, you name it.
That's how banks make their money. It's called the net interest margin. They pay you almost nothing on your deposit.
But they charge a much higher interest rate on the long-term loans they make with your money. The risk here is what's called an asset-liability mismatch.
Your deposit is a liability for the bank that they have to pay back on demand right now.
But their assets, the money they lent out, are all tied up in illiquid 30-year mortgages.
And this is exactly what killed Silicon Valley Bank.
Precisely. They took customer deposits and invested them in long-term assets, like Treasury bonds, back when interest rates were near zero.
Then the Fed started hiking rates, aggressively.
And the market value of those long-term bonds just plummeted. So when depositors started asking for their money back, SVB had to sell those bonds at a huge loss.
Which wiped out their capital. It's textbook liquidity risk.
Now here's where Ardoino draws the sharp contrast. He argues Tether completely avoids that kind of risk.
Because when Tether gets $100 for USDT, they don't lend it out.
Right. They don't buy long-term interest-sensitive assets. Instead, they buy ultra-safe, highly liquid, short-term U.S. Treasury bonds.
And the emphasis on short-term is key.
It's the genius of the model. These things mature so quickly, sometimes in just a few weeks, that they aren't really exposed to that interest rate volatility.
And let's just be clear about U.S. Treasury bonds. They're considered the safest asset on the planet.
Because they're backed by the U.S. government, which can tax and will print the global reserve currency. The chance of default is practically zero.
The scale of this operation is just staggering. It really shows how much financial power Tether has now.
Ardoino recently claimed they hold so many of these two bonds
That they actually hold more than some sovereign nations.
He specifically named the UAE and Australia. The point is, their money isn't being lent out into risky ventures. It's held in the most stable, most convertible asset there is.
And on top of that, there's their financial cushion.
A massive cushion. See, Tether is a lean tech company. They don't have the huge overhead of a traditional bank with branches everywhere.
Their main revenue is just the interest they earn on those billions in safe T-bonds.
And right now, they're reporting about $3.3 billion in surplus equity.
That's pure profit, held as a buffer on top of the 100% backing for every stablecoin.
It's a huge defense against a black swan event. And Ardoino loves to contrast that with how close to the minimum capital requirements many traditional banks operate.
So, this whole dispute, it really comes down to a philosophical divide. It's about how S&P defines risk versus how Tether measures it.
Ardoino's main point is that S&P is using an outdated yardstick.
One designed for fractional reserve banks that take deposits.
And they're trying to apply it to a totally different model, a technology company that's essentially a dollar conduit. He's arguing they're rated low simply because they're not a traditional U.S. regulated bank.
This brings us to a really interesting distinction in risk types.
Yes. Traditional banks face liquidity risk and credit risk. The risk that their borrowers just won't pay them back.
Tether, by its design, pretty much eliminates those.
But S&P is focused on what they call regulatory and operational risk.
And isn't that a valid concern? I mean, even if Tether's assets are rock solid, they operate in this global regulatory gray zone.
That's a counter-argument, absolutely.
They're outside the oversight of the FDIC or the Federal Reserve. Isn't that a lack of institutional accountability a huge risk factor in itself?
That's the critical question. And Ardoino basically admits that traditional bodies see it as a risk, but he frames that flexibility as an advantage.
He says it allows them to be more efficient, to maintain stronger asset backing.
He even made this kind of backward suggestion. He said S&P would probably only give Tether a high score if they operated more like a traditional bank.
Meaning if they started lending out customer funds for profit?
Exactly. If they introduced the very mismatch that leads to systemic risk in the first place. He's saying the whole ratings hierarchy is upside down.
And to really drive his point home, he brings up Tether's social mission.
Right. He argues that Tether is a vital payment rail for millions of people in developing nations.
Places where local currencies are hit by hyperinflation and the banking systems are unreliable or failing.
For those users, safety isn't some glamorous bank label. Safety is having access to the U.S. dollar, backed by U.S. Treasuries. It's a lifeline.
Okay, so let's pivot this institutional fight into some practical lessons for you, the listener. How does this apply to managing your own money?
The first lesson here is, I think, profound. Never, ever trust a rating or a label blindly.
The SVB collapse proved that. Even the most prestigious ratings can be completely wrong when the underlying assets are unstable.
So when FUD hits, when you hear a respected source casting doubt on something you hold, the first rule is don't panic.
Instead, you perform what we can call Arduino's FUD test. You calmly check the fundamentals. You have to ask the sophisticated question. What is actually backing my investment?
Yeah.
Is your money backed by something tangible and liquid, like short-term T-bonds? Or is it based on a promise that relies on someone else paying you back way down the road?
True safety is in that high liquidity and quality asset backing.
Lesson 2 is about risk management. We've seen that banks have liquidity risk and stablecoins have regulatory risk. No system is perfect.
Which just reinforces the need for smart diversification. And not just across different types of assets, but across different types of risk.
And we can actually apply Tether's model, that commitment, to a huge surplus buffer to your own personal finances.
Through the emergency fund concept. The standard advice is, 6 months of living expenses?
Right.
But Tether's models suggest you should really aim to overinsure your stability. Think of that emergency cash as your personal $3.3 billion surplus.
And it has to be held in something ultra-liquid, no tying it up in stocks or real estate. It has to be immediately available, just like Tether's T-bonds.
Don't just meet the minimum. Build a buffer that's robust and ready for anything. And finally, the last lesson is maybe the simplest. Keep an open mind. The traditional banking model has been around for centuries, but it's clearly prone to failure when conditions change.
New digital standards are evolving incredibly fast. You have to be willing to learn about new frameworks like a 100% asset-backed model.
But always balance that curiosity with critical thinking. Don't get swept up in trendy promises that don't have that solid T-bond backing.
At the end of the day, this deep dive has shown us that the debate between Tether and S&P reveals a core truth.
Financial safety really should be judged by the quality of the underlying assets and an entity's ability to pay its debts instantly.
Regardless of what regulatory label it has or doesn't have, which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to consider.
If the world's standard for safety is the short-term U.S. Treasury bond, and new digital entities are adopting that bulletproof backing, while traditional banks continue to rely on a riskier, mismatched lending model.
Does the entire financial hierarchy need to fundamentally redefine what systemic risk even means?
Shouldn't we be prioritizing asset composition and high liquidity over institutional longevity and outdated regulatory labels?
A powerful question for a rapidly changing world. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. Keep exploring complex topics, and we'll catch you next time.